Yes, so the major rift was over some creative differences in the sense that Nick, Nick and Denise had sporadically created something that wanted to look that mimicked Frankenstein, but they called it Hunkenstein, and I believe that was true to real life events. Um, and at the time, I think that even the way they went about introducing it to Steve was at a very difficult time in Steve's life because his father had just passed. He had gone to India and was dealing with loss and grief. And instead of them being, or at least Nick being a little more sensitive to him, was like, it's my way or the highway. And that was like, already kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back because he was already having issues that Otis in particular wanted to, um, I believe, shadow Steve because he was in awe of Steve's tactics and getting free promotion and working more of a merchandise angle to propel more success and more wealth. Um, and he was fine with doing that, but or allowing for Otis to shadow him. But the fact that he was just clear on the social climate that he was living in the sense that, yeah, Otis is cute in the club, but let's keep him out of the public eye. And thought about it and was like, my calendars are going to sell if I have a black man as one of the centerfolds inside the calendar. So, Otis was kind of feeling some kind of way like, wait a minute, everybody's kind of branching off of some form of success because of the calendar and it's bringing much more attention to the club and to them as dancers, and he wasn't getting the same kind of notoriety. So, and even with Nick, I feel like Nick, again, I feel like if these two men would have had much more of a open lines of communication, they would have really been onto something. But their egos um, and not for nothing, because when you dissect it on more of a social lens, Nick was kind of messed up. I mean, yes, Nick did bring in that creative sensibility to the business that would eventually propel it to the success that it became. But you also have to take into consideration it was a very, like I mentioned, like it was his way or the highway, and he wasn't really sympathetic in trying to. Now, again, I don't know these people in real life, and we're only dictating the show based on what we are seeing in the show and how it was written. But from what I'm judging it based on the show, it seems like he was not sensitive to the fact that, let's just be honest here, the way that we are raised and cultivated in this country is very kind of like, this is what I want to do, this is what's going to be, and you got to accept it as is. And it doesn't take into consideration other people's sets of values, other people's cultures, how they're raised. So now, given, let's just be honest, I feel like Steve, or at least the interpretation of Steve in this show, was the pursuit of success. And even if that meant even doing some races as BS. But there are cultural sensitivities here that I don't think were taken into consideration and that I thought was really messed up on Nick's part. And then that trickery, because it was this constant, I get it, he was trying to evade the micromanagement that Steve was always kind of bestowing on Nick, but that whole napkin deal, and I get it, back in the day it was just kind of like, let's just sign off on something, doesn't matter. And that's a quick lesson to people: if there's a signature, there's signatures and dates, it could be legally binding, so don't be signing stuff without going and consulting your lawyer. And I, unfortunately, it was a boo-boo that cost Steve highly, because he basically duped Steve into signing the rights away of Chippendales, and I'm sorry, hold on a second. Don't want to get this wrong. In perpetuity, which is a little hard to, it doesn't roll off the tongue all that great, but basically means forever. So basically, Nick is able to bamboozle Steve into signing the rights away for the road show. And even, I think, not the New York Club, but definitely the road show, which was proved to be way more lucrative than any show that's static and permanent in any particular city, because it's open to anything and it can go anywhere, and it just grew legs, and it grew much more popularity and became much more successful financially. And then the fact that it emphasized on that word in perpetuity, that unfortunately Steve did not know the meaning of that word, and was just so thick at that time, in the sense that he thought he knew everything, and he was already going through his own legal issues with one particular, well, no, I'm sorry, there were 13 cases, but the one that kind of like was to open Pandora's box was one patron that was African American and noticed that there was an issue with him coming into the club. Now, up until this point, the club was only open to women for the showtime, and then they wrap it up and let people go home. But it was quickly changed, because then there was an opportunity after the show to open it up to just men as well, so that way the night grows longer, the financial means become bigger. And so, and men were privy to that. They were like, well, now that these women are like sexually charged, what's a perfect way to get laid than to go in there after the show when they're all turned on and whatnot. And at first it was fine, but then all of a sudden this concept of a VIP or a members only club or whatever, the concept of that card. And so black men started realizing that, if you were black, you weren't allowed in the club. It was just white men. And then we discovered that, that he had been maintaining this ridiculous policy because he wanted to keep it, again, upscale and classy, whatever definition. But I mean, he was completely wrong in doing that. But he had been treated that way. So, but in a way, you're following in the same footsteps of the things, how you wouldn't want to be treated, but you're perpetuating it in your own club. So it's a dichotomy here of like victim, but then also perpetrator here, because it's like the way you wouldn't want to be treated, you're treating these people who want to patronize your club. Nonetheless, so there's just a lot, and this is why I'm saying, y'all, because we see two faces to everybody. Not that I'm saying two faces in the sense that we see that not everybody's 100% saint and not everybody's 100% devil. Now, I will say that there were things that they omitted, in the sense that Steve had 2 children with Irene, and we know of him because of the docu-series and other interviews that he would go on and try to branch off of the Chippendale success, because somehow, and I'm not sure how they lost the rights or ownership of the concept of Chippendales, and they were not handsomely rewarded at the end, and so he's had to do other things. I believe it's called Strippendales or something like that. But he's tried to maintain the legacy of his father that he knows have worked very hard to keep. But I will say, towards the end, we do see that yes, Steve is successful. He is able to off Nick DeNoia, his true killer, and it was either the man was an incredible shot or whatever, but literally just, I think it just took one shot and it was a wrap for, unfortunately, Nick DeNoia. And his name was Gilbert Rivera Lopez. And he was hired by Ray Colon, which we see in the show was played by Robin De Jesus, who pledges his loyalty to him very in this, hold on a second. very, very much into this like Godfather kind of esque. There's a scene where Robin is kissing like Steve's ring. It's very, and again, I feel like it's for dramatic purposes, but I will say the last episode we see that Steve has benefited off of Nick's passing. And this is where I will say I loved the show, all 8 episodes, but I do feel like we could have benefited from another 2 episodes because there was so much that I don't feel like they covered on how, like, well, for one thing, how Steve, sorry, is able to acquire the rights. And I believe it did stay in Nick DeNoya's estate or maybe testament, but he was able to claim it from the family. And I think the family knew of Steve's rivalry with their family member of Nick, and but how he was able to attain that. I think the final episode, we just kind of fast forward through so much. And we see that I feel like Steve has aged a little bit. This may have been like in the early 90s when he got caught. And the other thing I will say that they omitted was that the FBI was tipped off because of a guy, the hitman, the original hitman. Now he got away. I want to say Steve got away with Nick DeNoya's murder. And it went unchecked for a number of years. Now, I think he felt that he was invincible because there had been arson in the past with Ray Colon, and now murder with Ray Colon, and now let's move on to the attempt of offing 3 male dancers, former Chippendale dancers, that were branching out to doing their own thing in Europe, and I believe their burlesque show was entitled Adonis. And so he really had an issue with people rivaling him. So of course he gets his little buddy of Ray Colon, but Ray didn't necessarily was involved in that sense. He hires yet another hitman, and he goes by the name of Strawberry, and that's why I say the documentary is very crucial here, because then that fills in the missing puzzle pieces that we didn't get, that I don't feel the series fulfills. It wasn't just Ray Colon. It was attached to Strawberry because Strawberry contacts the FBI and lets them know that, hey, I got, or I was being offered X amount of money to go to Europe and inject 3 dancers with arsenic. And I'm just not cool with that. So somehow it leads over to an investigation with Ray, and then Ray, not wanting to serve a million years in jail, starts singing like a little songbird, and lets it be known that it was all of Steve's doing, and he was just like contacting or contracting these people. And we find out of Gilberto Rivera Lopez, who's the one that was the trigger man behind Nick DeNoya's murder, but it was tied to Steve. Now, what we do see in episode 8 is fast forward all of that, and also a divorce with Irene, Steve, and you can see he's very paranoid. Somehow he just thought that he would be in a safer space if he were to have Ray in Switzerland, and that's why it's titled Switzerland. They actually do meet up in Switzerland, but it plays out like a Greek tragedy because we see that Ray had been like completely devoted to Steve up until this point, but you can see a desperation in his eyes that he needs for Steve to confess all of the wrongdoing here, and that he had been constantly contracted to do unlawful things like arson and murder, murder for hire. So it really played out beautifully in the sense that